Hi everybody, Professor Ken here. I've got Sassafras with me today, and this is the first video on editing a draft of a novel. Okay, so at this point, I'm operating under the assumption that you've essentially finished writing the first draft of your novel. You've got it done from start to finish, and now we're going to talk about editing. And we're going to talk about editing in 5 steps. So essentially 5 separate drafts of your novel. I'm not a big fan of rewriting a novel. I'm a bigger fan of editing a novel using Microsoft Word, which has a really good track changes function. That's the way I do it. And when I use the track changes function, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to sort of I'm trying to keep track of the changes. But more importantly, I like to see the changes I'm making and compare them to the original, which Microsoft Word makes available to me sort of on like the right-hand side of the screen. So I always kind of know what's going on in a particular section that I'm editing. If I feel like if I go back to something I changed and I like it turns out I like the original, I can just go back, I can just literally just click one button and reject the changes I made, and it brings me back to that original text, which I think is really fantastic. But we're going to focus on 3 specific things for this first run through of your finished novel. I'm going to propose you only focus on these 3 things and leave everything else for a future edit. Okay, so here's my rationale for this. I think a lot of writers, when they finish a novel, 2 things happen. The first thing that happens is when a writer, especially a beginning writer, goes back through the draft, they tend to feel like their writing isn't that good. They get this sort of like, sometimes we call it the owl on our shoulders that sort of whispers in our ear that, the writing just, isn't very professional. It's garbage. It just, it's never going to get published and all that stuff. And it can be very discouraging when you finish a draft because in the moment you felt like you were doing really well. And then you go back and read it and you're like, wow, this really isn't that good. And the other big mistake I think a lot of writers make at this point is a lot of writers make the mistake of thinking they can go into a draft, go into like the editing phase of the writing process and just overwhelm themselves with so many things that they want to focus on, okay? And this becomes really difficult for the writer and it becomes really stressful for the writer. So if you focus on these 3 things I'm gonna suggest you focus on, you're gonna find that 1, your writing is gonna get better because you're going to focus on some things that are going to make your writing better right off the gate. And that can instill you with a sense of confidence. And just as importantly, you're also going to find that if you're not overwhelming yourself, it's a lot easier to go through the draft and actually finish it. And so what we're doing here is we're just going to stay nice and focused. We're going to recognize that our rough drafts are kind of junk. They're kind of garbage, and that's okay. We're going to acknowledge that they're okay. And just as importantly, we're going to focus on just a couple of things so that when we go into the second draft and we're editing the second draft, the things that we focused on are going to be kind of done. And we're going to focus on something different so that we're never overwhelmed, okay? So let's talk about the first thing I want you to focus on. The first thing that I want you to focus on as you go through your second draft is I want you to focus on clarifying action, okay? A lot of times when we write a first draft, we have this sort of like incomplete image in our heads of what's going on in our story, and we try to get it all down on the page. But oftentimes what happens is when we go back and we reread like a moment, like it doesn't even have to be an action scene. It can be a fight between 2 people at the dinner table. It can be a scene, a chaotic scene at a child's birthday party or whatever. What I want you to think about is how can I revise the action to make sure that the reader understands exactly what's happening as I'm imagining it in my head, okay? This is not the place where you ask other people for advice, where you have other people read your draft or anything like that. This is a place where you think about what you've written down, and you be that skeptical, curious editor who's basically thinking, well, am I picturing exactly what I want the reader to picture, or am I missing something? Okay. So that's the first thing you're going to look for. And the reason you're going to look for this, as you're looking through your first draft, is because a lot of the time when you're working on a second draft, you'll feel a little bit more familiar with the scenes because you've got them written down. And a lot of the time, if you're like me, if you're a writer like me who likes to, keep pushing forward rather than pausing and taking really long breaks to overthink a lot of chapters and scenes in a story, what happens is you're going to find gaps in the action. And this is your chance to fill in those gaps. This is your chance to clarify what you've written so that the reader is visualizing exactly what you want them to visualize, okay? So the second thing you're going to focus on is you're going to focus on revising the dialogue, all right? Take a look at the conversations that are happening in your story. Where do those conversations feel stilted? Where do those conversations feel like they belong in a comic book? Where do those conversations feel like they belong in a 90-minute movie rather than a novel? Remember, one of the benefits of a novel or a novella is that you have a little bit of time to let those conversations flow very organically, which is not something that necessarily happens in a lot of movies. Conversations in movies move really quickly. And a lot of times, if you ever read like a draft of a screenplay, a lot of times what you'll see is by the time you get to the final draft of a screenplay, a lot of conversations have been cut and cut and cut and cut so that they're just at the bare bones, bare minimum required for the audience to comprehend what the storyteller wants them to comprehend. That's not on accident. That's very intentional. In a novel, you get a little bit more time. Look for those places where the conversation could be drawn out a little bit, where it feels rushed, okay? But also look for those places where the conversation feels forced or even almost fake, okay? Unrealistic. This is an issue with a lot of beginning writers, especially. They try to write conversations between characters, and if you don't practice this at all, if you don't practice revising conversations, what you're going to have is a lot of stilted dialogue. You're going to have a lot of dialogue that just doesn't feel realistic, and it's going to draw the reader away from your story. So you want to keep an eye out for those points. You want to keep an eye out for those places, because by the time you finish writing working on the second draft of your novel, it's going to, those conversations, as you make them better, your book, you're going to be amazed at how much better your book feels when you get to the second draft and you start editing your second draft, okay? So those two things are super important, but let's talk about one more idea for your first run through. The last thing you should look for is places where you can add more detail, okay? And so this kind of connects to the idea of like clarifying the action, but a lot of times what makes a first draft feel very unoriginal and what makes a first draft feel very it just doesn't feel like it has anything yet and can become very discouraging for the writer is that a lot of details are missing, okay? So what you want to do is, again, you want to look for those places where you hurried through the writing process because you were interested in getting to the end. And you want to look for those places where your reader is going to struggle to visualize what the scene looks like, or visualize what a character looks like, if that's important to you, or visualize maybe not just what's happening in the scene, but what objects exist in the scene, what the furniture looks like in the living room, in other words, okay? And so what we're doing here is, in this first draft, we're actually doing a lot of adding, right? We're thinking about where to add details for the action to make sense. We're looking for places where we've rushed through the dialogue and we're adding dialogue and playing with that dialogue a little bit. And then, of course, we're looking for places where we don't have enough description yet. And we're trying to think more about, where can I make sure the reader is visualizing the story that I have in my head, okay? Those are the three things I want you to look for. But there's one other thing I think you can do during this first run through. I don't want you to focus on it yet, but I want you to jot down notes as you're going. When you read through your draft, and even when you're like off making dinner, even when you are, at a movie, or you're at a concert, or you're going out for beers or wine with friends or whatever, every once in a while, an idea is going to come to you that you know is going to make your novel better. An idea is going to come to you that is just going to light a fire under your creative mind, and you're just going to think to yourself, oh my gosh, I need to add this to chapter 3, or oh my gosh, this is a great idea to connect these two chapters. Rather than try to put those into the draft yet, what I want you to do instead is just open up a Microsoft Word document or a Google Doc and just keep track of those ideas. You can do it on your phone too. You can open up the Notes app on your phone. Keep track of those ideas that are coming to you, because what we're going to do in a future editing session is we're going to focus entirely on those ideas that come to us. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're going to be very specific and deliberate with the editing process, and then as we get into the later drafts, we're going to keep doing this. We're going to layer the quality so that as we go from draft to draft to draft, our story becomes more and more incredible. And you're going to be amazed at how quickly you're going to fall in love with your book as you move from draft to draft. So bear with me. Keep up the great work. And when we get to the next video, we're going to talk about how to edit draft 2 after you've done all of this. Okay, so I'll talk to you soon. Have a good day.